So Frank, as you think about grassland birds,
Yeah.
if you had to pick one plant that is like the best plant for grassland birds, what would you pick?
Well, that's a trick question. That's got to be a trick question because there's not one plant that is like the silver bullet or the magic elixir for grassland birds. It takes a diversity of plants. Not only a diversity of plant species, but we're talking about forbs, we're talking about grasses, we're talking about legumes, we're talking about, in some cases, shrubby cover scattered around. These are important parts of grassland bird life history. So it's not just one plant, it's a diversity of them.
Okay, okay. Well, so as you think about grassland birds, like what is in this grouping of grassland birds? What's in that group?
Well, sure. First thing I want to establish is if you look at overall grassland birds as a guild, they're the #1 declining guild of birds in the whole country.
Okay.
They're declining faster than forest songbirds. They're declining faster than waterfowl. Anything like that. They are declining at a rapid rate, and it's because of loss of habitat, loss of large-scale grasslands. So they need large-scale grasslands that provide a diversity of things that they need for their life history. For example, they have to have a place to nest. And so they nest in grass clumps most of the time. Most of these grassland birds nest in grass clumps. So we're talking about Henslow sparrows,
Okay.
grasshopper sparrows. We're talking about eastern meadowlarks, which have declined over 75%
Wow.
since the 1970s. We're talking about northern bobwhite, which most people know or have been on a steep decline and is one of those species that we're really concerned about, not only from a ecosystem health standpoint, but from a recreational standpoint. So all of those species kind of combine, and there's others that define kind of this grassland bird guild. But they need, first of all, they need grasslands to nest in. They
Okay.
tuck their nests under clumps of grasses for most of the time. Other times they'll put them under, shrubby thickets, maybe some forbs, things like that. But for the most part, we're looking at clump forming grasses like little blue stem, big blue stem that they can put a nest in, or sometimes they'll nest off the ground a little bit higher in that clump. So that's kind of the first thing they need.
Okay, so like this grass here,
Yes.
they would get in under the leaves of this grass to nest. Is
Absolutely.
that-
They would
yeah.
use the duff that's here from last year's growth.
Okay.
And they would form like a little nest bowl, and they would have their nest there. If this was a little bit higher of duff, maybe they would put it up here a little bit further. But this is kind of what they're looking for. And then they'll actually take with their beak and they'll pull some of this live growth over the top to create kind of a roof. And this is kind of a protected area, and it's very, very secure. It's very, very unnoticeable, very, very hidden. You can walk grasslands for days and never see these grassland bird nests because they are so well hidden.
Yeah. So the grasses are the really important part for the nesting part of the
I
life
consider
cycle.
these grasses to be really critical for the nesting phase, whether they are precocial birds like wild turkeys and quail, which when they hatch, the mama takes them and takes them away, or if they're altricial birds like meadowlarks, grassland sparrows, things like that, where the mama and daddy are constantly coming in there and feeding them. These grasses form that real framework for that nest building and nest care structure.
Okay, okay. So do the grasses have other functions in a grassland that are like real noteworthy for grassland birds other than nesting?
Yeah, sure. You can see how tall this clump is here, and it's going to get much taller. But these provide valuable places for many birds to grasp on and sing when they are looking for mates. So they call from these stems, or they'll use dead stems of grasses to grasp their little feet on and call. We're talking about songbirds mostly.
Yeah.
It provides valuable cover. So when they get in here at night and roost, or when they're just loafing around and hiding from predators, it provides valuable cover for that. So not only nesting, but singing perches and cover, I think, would be the two top things that grasses provide.
Okay, okay. So the grasses are important, and then when I think about plants, I think about different functional diversity groups. I've got my warm and cool season grasses, which I suppose are functioning very similarly. They'll
Correct.
use both warm and cool seasons
Right.
for those things. And then I think of the native forbs and legumes.
Yeah.
And then the shrubs would be another functional diversity group. So how are the native forbs, like that sunflower, or there's other native forbs around here too, like the white beard tongue or the Ohio spider, how are those used by the
Yeah,
wildlife?
so the way I look at it is these are really your food factories for
Okay.
grassland birds. So right now there's no seed on here on this sunflower, but later there will be seed that is produced from this sunflower, and that produces a great high energy food source for all kinds of grassland songbirds to prepare them for the winter time if they're resident birds, or to get them ready for migration if they're heading south. Also, another way that I can see this as a food factory is these forbs produce and attract tons of insects.
Okay.
And so these grassland birds, when they're very young, the vast majority of their diets are invertebrates, whether it's insects or spiders or other invertebrate type groups. That's the majority of their diet. And forbs are fantastic, much better than grasses in terms of producing and attracting insects.
Okay.
So a diversity of forb around the landscape provide places where these birds, whether they're precocial again, like turkeys and quail chicks, as they can get in here and grab insects off of these, or if they're just staying in the nest until they fledge, the adults can come over here and grab insects and bring them to the nest. So I really look at forbs as food factories throughout the growing season and into when it's sort of becoming dormant for these grassland birds.
Okay. So as I look at the sunflower, I'm like, I don't see insects just crawling all over it. But what you're telling me is if I look closer, there's a lot of insects there that those birds are seeing that I'm not. Is that
certainly? As you look closer, as you get down lower in here, and as you're on a, got to remember, they're very, very small. And as they're rooting around through here, you can see in here, you not only have this sunflower, but you have this matrix of ragweed and other forbs that are in here too, that are producing and attracting insects. So while they may not, like a quail chick may not be able to reach up here and get an insect, a grasshopper sparrow adult certainly could, but they could be picking insects off the ragweed and the clover and the other things. Well, that may not be a native, but it's still part of this matrix that's in here that's attracting and providing and producing insects for these birds. So yeah, we're not just flushing hordes of grasshoppers. We're not, you know, and the cool thing about that is the timing of these chicks when they're coming off really corresponds to the most abundance of insects that you'll see. So as we start to get in, we're a little bit early on the nesting end. We don't have a lot of chicks being produced right now. We're kind of in this incubation phase right now. But as chicks are being produced, you can walk through these grasslands and start to see more and more insects as the caterpillars, or excuse me, as the butterflies lay their eggs, the caterpillars are hatching, you know, the larval grasshoppers are starting to develop and they're starting to jump around. That coincides the time when most chicks are on the ground. So nature is working together on that.
Interesting. So you're saying as the population of the insects is going higher,
right,
the birds tend to be nesting too, because they need, when they're young hatch, they need that food source,
right,
and it's there ready for them.
Yeah, it corresponds really well, particularly to the peak of hatching.
Yeah,
you know, that's when these birds need these insects the most, and so that tends to be when the most abundant of insects is out there.
Interesting. Yeah. So the grasses are kind of like the home and the perch.
Yep.
The forbs tend to be the food factory.
Certainly.
Both in, and we've talked a lot about the insect component, and so they're eating a lot of insects during the summer, right?
Yes, right.
And then is the seeds more of a winter, fall, when there's not insects kind of thing? Is that how it goes?
Yeah, that's typically how it goes. So when they're growing, they need a high protein food source to grow feathers, because feathers are made out of keratin, or really. So that's a protein. So they need high protein food source to quickly grow feathers and to quickly grow. Then as they transition into the winter time or into the fall and then into the winter, they need more high energy foods, right? And so a diversity of forbs provides a diversity of different nutrients and vitamins that they need. So a sunflower seed may provide a different type of nutrition than, say, a goldenrod or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, or a sunflowers may be different within that. A Maximilian may be different than a sawtooth or something. So having that diversity out there, so that there's a diversity of seeds available, that some are more palatable than others, some are more preferred than others.
Okay.
You really need that diversity, because if you're missing something that the birds really want, they're not getting the nutrition that they need, or they'll move off the landscape to go and find that nutrition that they need. So they could leave your place. So having a diversity of these forbs that are producing a different variety of seeds throughout the landscape is really important.
Yeah, so it kind of makes me think of like how some of the, I guess, was it the Native American tribes or the settlers, but anyway, they had the corn and the beans,
right,
and you ate them together because this one's missing this component and this one's high in this component.
Yeah, high in fat,
so,
and high in energy. Right.
Yeah, then you mix them
Right.
together, and so you mix the different seeds together, just the same as we humans do too.
That's a great point, because ragweed, in here, it's a part of the native matrix here. It produces a high fat seed, right? Really high in fat. Other seeds will produce a lot of energy, right?
Okay.
A lot of calories. And so if you have a diversity of those, much the same way you're talking about with eating corn and beans, birds are much the same way. If they eat just a high fat diet their entire year, they're not meeting some of their nutritional plane. So you need a variety of plants that provide that variety of seed sources that meet their entire nutritional needs.
Yeah. Well, I guess as far as like, so you've got shelter,
Yep.
you've got food.
Yep.
So we've got the grass functional diversity group, the forb functional diversity group. Does the legume functional diversity group really have any special component? Like maybe it's a higher protein seed?
Yeah, it's a higher protein seed. I really like legumes because they tend to, so your lespedezas, things like that, your desmodiums, those things produce, when you see them, they're a big seed, generally much bigger than most other forb seeds or many other forb seeds. So that's a big protein-packed snack right there. So they can pick up, just a few desmodium seeds or a few lespedeza seeds and really get the energy they need. So I really like a partridge pea. Illinois bundleflower is another one that not only produces insects but produces that big seed that's full of high fat content to really boost their nutritional plane as they go on. So I really love legumes as a critical part of this whole system when we're thinking about grassland birds.
Yeah. So the legumes kind of have a unique role among the forbs.
Sure.
I mean, they're just one type of forbs,
Sure.
but they have their own unique role that they fill.
Yeah.
Are there any other like plant families, wildflower families, forb families that you think of, like the asters, or does anything else have a special role, or is it just really diversity is important because everything's got its own little role that it fills?
Well, I think diversity is really important, and to have a diversity of that stuff out there. And the cool thing about asters, you mentioned asters. So asters tend to bloom and put on seed later on in the year, which then is going to draw a whole new suite of insects that are going to be pollinating that, which is just another food source out there for those birds as they get later on into summer and fall.
Okay.
So if you didn't have these late blooming, late seeding plants, you wouldn't have those insects that are drawn to them, then you wouldn't have that food source. So having a diversity that blooms early, middle, and late is the way to go for providing for the entire life history needs of birds. Now, a lot of times when our asters are blooming, maybe a lot of our migratory songbirds are out of here, but we still have resident birds that use these grasslands, like wild turkey, bobwhite quail, things like that could benefit from those asters. So if songbirds maybe don't benefit here, they're benefiting somewhere. Maybe the birds that are coming from north, they stop over here, benefit from the food that the asters provide, and then head south.
Yeah.
So you got to think about grassland birds, not only where we're at in the landscape, but where we're at in the migratory corridor, because there's a lot of grassland birds that'll be coming from the Dakotas and overstopping here in Missouri before they head south. And we need to provide for their nutritional and their cover needs right here too.
Yeah. So I guess with the forbs, you pointed out like having a diversity of forbs is really important because of the different seeds they make. Mm-hmm. And we want to balance our corn and our bean seeds and whatever. Mm-hmm. But then it's also really important from the standpoint of having different forbs because they draw insects at different times.
Right.
And so we want this chain of insects always being produced.
Yes.
And the same thing that is producing lots of insects on April 1st is not the same thing that's producing them on July 1st is not the same thing that's producing them on October 1st.
That's right. That's right. That's a really good point. That's why you need forbs that are active and growing through all parts of the early spring, mid-spring, early summer, late summer, all the way to fall. So if you can have that diversity, if you have just one species that makes up the variety of your grassland, whether it's probably in a planting or something like that, if you've chose one or two species, then those are going to peter out at some point, or they're going to come on late, and they're going to miss a whole life history portion that these birds need. So you've got to have plants that are blooming, that are growing throughout the growing season to provide these life history. I keep going back to that, these life history needs of these birds, because it changes. That's the thing, is we got to remember they start out as little chicks, and then they end up as adults, and their needs for cover and their needs for food change throughout that as they're from a baby to an adult. And so we need to provide for that entire suite of life history needs with plants that are blooming and growing throughout the entire growing season.
So we've talked a lot about the food through the different seasons, and how insects are a part, and then seeds are a part, and that changes through the seasons. And we've talked about, like, as far as structure, the animals, during nesting, they want to get in under these grasses. What does the other part of the habitat look like during the rest of the year, if that makes sense? Like, after we've done nesting, do we still care about grasses, or how are we sheltering then? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So let's say we're into the late fall and midwinter. We have a lot of course, we have our resident birds, but we have a lot of birds that overwinter right here. So grassland songbirds that may be produced in the Dakotas, but they're overwintering right here, in the mid-south to the south. They're not going all the way to Mexico or Central America. They're overwintering right here. And so these grasses provide excellent cover for those birds. So those birds are looking for cover. They're looking for protection from winter elements, whether it's snow or wind. They can get in there and they can be really protected. As these grass clumps, they can be very hold up really well to severe winter weather. And so these grassland birds are looking for that structure and that warmth that these grasses provide. At the same time, there's still a lot of residual seeds left these forbs are provided, and that's what these birds are feeding on. And then they're feeding on them throughout the entire winter, and they're trying to build up their fat reserves so that they could head north when it's time to breed. So they need cover and they need food throughout that entire winter portion. And these diverse native grasslands provide that.
Yeah. So this is really providing the home during the winter too.
Yeah, this is great. This is a great home. These provide great food, so they've got everything they need in these grasslands.
Yeah, and because it's all mixed together, we don't have to go on that side of the fence to get our food and this side of the fence to get our shelter. We have it all mixed together.
Yeah, that's super critical when you're talking about diversity, and diversity not only within a property, but within, a small portion of your property. You need that entire diversity, right next to each other. And this is a great example where we got nesting, cover, we got home, and we got food right next to it. If this was just in a complete grass field and over here we had a field full of forbs, well, then that doesn't work. These chicks have to, when they're hatched, either mama has to fly way over here to bring them food, or they have to get up and truck way over there, when it's time to eat. And that doesn't work well. You've got to have this diversity, within this matrix.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a great example of having cover and food right close to each other.
So as I think about like the change that you talk about, the grassland birds and their populations just plummeting and the lack of habitat being the primary cause of that, I just think about one thing that we can really do on the landscape is to turn agricultural landscapes, there's so many agricultural landscapes, the more we can include diversity of native plants, because native plants and native birds go together.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could change that picture a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. These birds are declining primarily because of habitat loss. Whether it's habitat loss in the northern plains or right here in the southern plains, or in the Ozarks, these grasslands are declining range-wide, and so with it go the grassland birds. There's other issues that are going on the wintering grounds in the south, but primarily it's because of habitat loss. And one way to reverse that is to, in agricultural landscapes, reintroduce this matrix of diversity that is so important to meet those life history needs. So pastures that are cool season dominated pastures, adding warm season grasses and forbs to your operation is super critical to provide that, because cool season grass dominated pastures really don't provide a lot for grassland birds.
Yeah.
You really need to have some kind of warm season grassland, grasses, forbs, and a matrix to really provide that. So if we can convince more producers to add natives to their operation, whether it's a grazing operation or even to a cropping operation where they've got odd areas, where they've got low yielding areas, add diverse grasslands there, we're really going to start to add then and start to fix the problem of our grassland bird decline.
Yeah.
You know, Elizabeth, I think the only way we're going to reverse this grassland bird decline, which is so precarious and which has drawn really a lot of nationwide attention recently, is by adding more diverse grasslands onto the landscape. That's really the only way we're going to turn these around. These are grassland birds for a reason. They need grasslands. They can't survive in forests. They can't survive in wetlands. They can't survive in town. They've got to have grasslands. And one of the things about these birds is they really have to have scale. Grassland scale is important to them. So, you know, small 1 acre plantings in town or small 1 acre plantings here and there, you know, while beneficial, really aren't going to change the trajectory of these birds. We need producers to get on board with planting larger scale, diverse native grasslands on the landscape. And that's how we're going to begin to reverse that decline.
Yeah, that's interesting. So big landscapes are important.
Yeah.
Diverse native grasslands where you've got basically recreating a grassland like the bison would have seen.
Sure.
When they were here, that's going to be the important thing for reversing these trends,
Sure.
it sounds like.
Sure.
So I'm just thinking, like, as agricultural producers, you know, some will watch this video, like, you know, birds are fine.
Yeah.
I don't have any huge dislike for them, maybe.
Uh-huh.
But what benefit do they really give me as an agricultural, like, as a cattleman?
Yeah.
Why should I do this, like,
Yeah.
from the wildlife standpoint?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a question, and that's a point that I hear and that comes up, you know. One of the big ones is bobwhite quail, of course. Everybody remembers growing up with bobwhite and hearing them whistle and seeing their chicks running down the road and all this. And so, you know, if you're only thinking about bobwhite quail, that's a good place to start. But also, and to go back to bobwhite quail, the recreational benefits they provide through hunting and things like that. But also, if you take a step back and you look at this guild of birds as a whole, and what we talked about, what they're eating for the most, you know, for the biggest part of their lives while they're here is insects. You know, they provide a lot of ecosystem services. They eat a lot of insects. So that's less pests on your crops, that's less flies on your cattle. These are doing a lot of that insecticide work by just feeding on these insects. You know, there's a lot of grassland birds that are insectivores, like eastern kingbird, western kingbird, things like that. They just feed entirely on insects. They're swooping around like martins do, and they're catching insects.
Yeah.
That's a huge ecosystem benefit, whether it's reducing mosquitoes or reducing crop pests or whatever the case may be. These birds provide not only aesthetics, not only hearing a bobwhite whistle, not only seeing a bird on a fence post singing, but the ecosystem benefits they provide is really important.
Yeah, so it sounds like really as you get a more functioning ecosystem, of course that benefits the birds, but that benefits as an agricultural producer, that functioning ecosystem benefits me and my agricultural production as well, because I'm getting more, my cows are more content, the less insects, less insect pressure on my forage, all of those benefits come with it.
Absolutely, yeah. That's something that we don't often think about with these grassland birds that they're providing, but that's a super important benefit that they can provide, is just greater ecosystem health, greater a functioning ecosystem usually means a better overall production. So if we can get that functioning ecosystem, that's really important.
Okay. I'm Elizabeth with Hamilton Native Outpost, and this is Frank Loncarich with the Missouri Department of Conservation. Both of us are really passionate in what we do about native plants, about native wildlife, and how agriculture and those native plants, those diverse native grasslands can match up to benefit the producer and also the wildlife and the ecosystem.
Solid.